The last session we talked about our life commandments, understanding that we develop commandments out of our childhood. A lot of times our childhood could have a lot of pain. We talked about the 5 ways categorically we can be abused or hurt or wounded. But the question that I would like to address now would be like, what do we do with our pain? Okay, Pastor Dale, I've been abused. All right, well, so has a lot of other people, by the way. The question is, what do we do with it? Is there any hope for me? Because like I've been molested, I'm messed up. Sometimes I think I'm a freak. Okay, so what do we do with that? We've got to let that control our lives? Here's what I'd like to suggest to us. I'd like to suggest that how do we deal with pain? Let that be a question to you. How do we deal with pain? So I think sometimes we react to it and don't even realize what we're doing. I think there's at least 5 ways in which we deal with pain. Maybe if pain is deep enough, I would say one of those ways would be that we have a tendency to block. We can block out our pain. It's almost like an emotional shock, an emotional shock absorber. Just like physically our body can go into shock, emotionally we go into shock. We'll say something bad happens to a 5-year-old, something very serious happens, and a child doesn't know how to deal with that. How does a 5-year-old know how to deal with anything, really? They're learning ABCs and 1, 2, 3s. And so along comes this trauma, along comes this abuse. So we don't really know what to do with that. So our tendency can be, and for many people, we can just block it out and say, I'll deal with that at another time in my life. When is that other time? Well, I don't know. Sometimes as we get older, we say, I want to deal with this. Okay, and so sometimes it comes up that way. But we have to be aware that we have a tendency, and to protect ourselves, our defense mechanism is to block. That's a reality. Another reality is deny. I find that very interesting because I used to feel like when I was just learning how to counsel and talk, if people knew the difference, they would know how to address it. So a lot of times I'd spend time talking about the issue only to realize that some people didn't get it, doesn't want to get it, won't get it. They just flat out deny it. And it's like, they get a bunch of siblings together and someone says, Dad loved us. My dad loved me. And their siblings look at you like, what? Your dad broke your nose when you're 7 years old. Don't you remember that? It's like, yeah, but he meant well, and we just deny it. It's a form of protecting ourselves from our pain. It's a defense mechanism. Another one is suppress. Very interesting. Suppress, it's like it's there, and sometimes we know it's there, but we just push it down. And we can push it down so far sometimes, we don't even know we're pushing it down. We can push our feelings down so deep that we can't even identify our feelings. I've asked people that before in my office. This one person I'm thinking of, big old strong man, is about 6'4", and I asked him one time, his family's falling apart and he's going crazy, he's going to lose his business. And he's sitting there very polite and very controlled and very quiet. I said, hey, what are you feeling right now? And he looked at me like I could see his mind, he was searching. And then he almost got this fearful look like, whoa. And he looked at me and he said, I don't even know what you're asking me. He so pushed his feelings down so deep, he couldn't even identify his feelings. We call that suppression. The problem with suppression is it goes in and it stays in. I'll ask people, like, what are you doing with your anger? They're like, what anger? Like, where does your anger go? If you're angry and you don't want to admit to it, where does it go? We pushed it somewhere. It sits there like a volcano, percolates until a trigger or something reminds you of your pain, and then all of a sudden there's an explosion, and we have this like reaction, and one goes into a rage or something, and then comes back and like, whoa, I don't know what happened with that. Then we push it back down again. Suppression, it's the way we deal with our pain. Another one would be to justify. We justify our behavior. Or blame, that's another way. We go around justifying blame and like, I'll tell you why I do what I do, is because, and then there we go. Those are the ways we protect ourselves from pain. That gets in the way of our relationships with people. So some people like, don't go over there because like they're having a bad day. Why? What makes a bad day a bad day? And so sometimes you have to be aware of that we are capable of protecting ourselves from pain and don't even know we do it. To be able to receive from someone and say, hey, can I tell you something? Be very important. It helps us. I would like to give you a helpful exercise that can help us with this, help you with this. And so here's what I would like to suggest. If you're dealing with pain, it gets in the way, it's interfering with functioning adulthood, and it's constant, your husband or your wife is saying something, your children are saying something to you, and it's like, okay, I got to deal with this because I find myself reacting all the time. Here's a helpful exercise. I would give this exercise to everybody I know. It's something that I feel is a transition from childhood into adulthood. I find 1 Corinthians 13, verse 11 says this: when I was a child, I spake as a child, I acted like a child, and I reasoned as a child. But when I became an adult, I put away childish things. There comes a point in our life when we have to understand our childhood issues as we transition and mature into adulthood. Ecclesiastes talks about in chapter 12 that we're all going to give an account for the deeds we've done in our bodies, both good and evil. Someday when we are going to give an account to the Lord for how we lived our life. That's adulthood. I call that adult privilege. God has given to us the privilege to live my life the way I see fit under God's say. Not according to Uncle Johnny or not according to my broken up, messed up home. I decide. That's adulthood. You're taking charge of your life. One way to take charge of your life and transition out of the pain of childhood is to acknowledge your story. That's the exercise. Get a journal, write down your journal, and identify your pain. Think about that. Identify your pain. Some of you might go like, whoa, I'm not doing that. I'm trying to forget my past. I hear a lot of people say that to me. I don't want to talk about my past. I want to talk about going forward. I want to talk about going forward. That's a good thing to do. But you cannot go forward until you deal with your past. Your past will dictate how you behave. You have to own your past. If you don't own your past owns you. If you don't own your pain owns you. You have to own your life. It's your story. Why not tell it? What's there to be ashamed of? What's there to be afraid of? A healthy person will own their story. Everybody has a story. I'll give you some biblical illustrations of that. In the book of Daniel chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar tells his story of how he acted like a crazy man for 7 years. He acted like an ox in a field, eating grass like an ox. His fingernails grew like claws, and he was the most powerful man in the world. And he tells the story of how he finally came to his senses and understood the sovereignty of the Lord. And when you read Daniel chapter 4, it sounds like, hey, everybody, I want to tell you a story. I want to tell you my story of how God, it's a beautiful story. It's a great example. It's what so many people do that are healthy people. They've dealt with their story. They know how to share it and help others with it. So here's what I would suggest you do. Acknowledge your story, every bit of it, every detail of it. Be thorough. Don't back away from something that's shameful or hurtful. Acknowledge your story. Psalm 107 says this. In the NIV, it says, let the redeemed tell their story. It's a form of glorifying God when we can share, this is what happened to me, but here's what God did. It's a form of a testimony. It's beautiful. It's powerful. So acknowledge your story and then embrace your story. Embrace it. It's your story. If you can't embrace your story, you're basically rejecting yourself. And if you're rejecting yourself, you're going to feel like everybody else is rejecting you, and it gets in the way of interpersonal relationships and conflict, and you live in conflict. John 8:32, beautiful verse, one of my favorite verses. It refers to John telling us that Jesus taught when he said that the truth will set us free. We don't have to be afraid of the truth. Don't be afraid of the truth. The truth is your friend. Acknowledge the truth and let the truth set you free. If you don't acknowledge the truth, you set yourself up for our adversary, the devil, to pound on you and cause and give you shame. Don't you tell anybody your story because they might think that you're a freak. Don't tell anybody. So we hold it in. And so I don't think you're a freak. You think you're a freak. You're in bondage to your story. Own your story. And then once you embrace your story, you decide what to do with it. It's like coming out of childhood. Now I'm an adult. What am I going to do with my story? It's like this here. You write your story out and then in detail, make it thorough. Don't run away from anything. Tell the bad stuff. Write it out, and then find someone that you can trust, and then read your story. It's a form of confession. You're confessing to someone else. You're also telling your story to yourself. Officially now, you're admitting to your story. After you write your story, and after you process it, and after you own it, then you're left with a decision, which is being an adult. Now you get to choose what you're going to do with your story. It's interesting because sometimes all there is left to do is to forgive someone. But at that point, it's your choice. it's a great gift that we get from the Lord to be forgiven, and also a great gift to forgive. So I'm going to suggest to you, do you write out your story, give consideration. Maybe you're going to want to confront somebody. You're allowed as an adult, by the way. So take charge of your life, own your story, address what needs to be addressed, and those things you cannot address and you need to forgive, then forgive them. It's your way of setting appropriate boundaries and still going forward without the harshness within the soul of what the pain does to us. My suggestion is to write your story.